This is Dan Byram, Loading with Loops, and I'm talking to Bill Richardson today, another retiree. And our goal here is to learn a little bit more about the evolution of policing over the years. Bill, thanks for joining me on the call today. I appreciate it. I'd like to start with just hearing when and how you wound up getting into law enforcement.
Well, I got out of the Marine Corps. I needed a job.
When was that?
1974, and
74.
I needed a job. There was an opening on a small department. Somebody had told me I should go apply, and I did. And a week later, I was a policeman. Um, I spent I don't know 4, 5, 6 weeks in a car riding, with an officer. I was in uniform. I had a gun and a badge. Uh, then I went to the academy for 7 weeks.
Where did you attend an academy?
I went to the academy at Central Arizona College. It was a college design. It was a police academy designed to meet the needs of the non-metropolitan police departments.
Yeah.
It was like at the academy at Phoenix where you went. The design was based on lots of people, lots of resources, lots of money. Um, and where I went, I mean, we had people from rural departments, sheriff's offices, city police from throughout the state, where, like the deputy who went to the academy with me from Eastern Pinal County in Kearney, he may be the only deputy on for 100 miles.
Well, for the people who might be from the East Coast or aren't familiar with our back roads in Arizona, when you're talking about CAC, Central Arizona College down there, what town is that in?
It's between Casa Grande and Coolidge.
All right, and they can look up Casa Grande and
Yeah.
see the old ruins down there. But when we're talking about rural Arizona in the early 70s, that's still Wild West, I would kind of say quite a bit.
It was wild, wild west. I can remember holding people at gunpoint for a half an hour before a backup would get there. And I remember one night there were two of us working graveyard shift, and we got three armed burglars in a building. And the only other law enforcement officer on in the county was a highway patrolman 40 miles away.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't uncommon to be by yourself to answer, calls in the big city that you'd have a minimum of two officers, maybe 4 or 5 officers and a supervisor. It was just you.
Yeah. And in border states back then, there's a different breed of criminals running around, a lot of different kinds of outlaws and the
You
outlaw
know,
motorcycle gangs, the border criminals, the transient. It just seemed like every hoodlum from the east passed through southern Arizona to get to California at some point in time and back and forth.
well, we had one real active outlaw motorcycle gang in town. Um, there was the gang in Phoenix that was had an alliance with the gang there in Pinal County. There was a prominent gang in Tucson, and then there was a outlaw motorcycle gang camp out near Picacho between Casa Grande and Tucson in the desert. Um, we bordered 2 Indian reservations. Um, Choo Choo Road was a straight shot to the border for smugglers. So, and then we were right between Interstate 8 and Interstate 10. To your point, we'd get cross country criminals, smugglers, and just an assorted combination of all kinds of outlaws. And then at the time, we had 2 copper mines going, so we had over 3,000 miners in town. So, we had one of the questions they asked me in my interview when they hired me was, when was the last time you were in a fist fight? Because if you couldn't handle yourself, you were out of luck.
Yeah.
Every officer and employee in law enforcement wants to succeed, but do they have the tools they need? Backup is on the way. Excellence in law enforcement courses bridge the gap between strong departments and strong communities through often overlooked interpersonal and communication skills. Discover affordable, asynchronous, cutting edge online training in developing character, critical thinking, establishing trust, and command presence. Visit Sabbath Learning to investigate further. We offer individual, agency, and academic rates.
Yeah, I remember when I started, that was one of the questions too about being able to take care of yourself in a bar fight. So after you got out of the academy uh, and you went out on patrol, uh, how long did you work in patrol division?
I was a patrolman for just about a year, and I got called in one day and was told that they were going to send me to the DEA in Phoenix. Um, and the next thing you know, I was part of the DEA task force out of the Phoenix division, and I worked really throughout Arizona, along the border, in California.
And you were there for a while.
I was there for 3 years, and from there I went to the State Narcotics Strike Force in Tucson.
Who all was in that?
That was the original concept behind the strike force was the four border counties, Cochise, Pima, Santa Cruz, and Yuma, uh, were not happy with the response they were getting from the state, and they formed an alliance to deal more effectively with narcotics and organized crime trafficking that was cross-border. So it was the four border counties, the sheriffs. It included the county attorneys, and then it grew statewide. And then within the organization, there were representatives from DEA, immigrations, customs, ATF, and the FBI. And we had our own in-house prosecutors, and we had access to prosecutors from Pima County and the Attorney General's office that were available to travel statewide to prosecute cases in rural counties. It was the 5 years for me between the DEA and the strike force with my partner. It was sort of like have gun will travel. We got moved from town to town and case to case and project to project, and always kept a bag in the trunk of the car, and it was no surprise where I'd wake up sometimes.
That's a harsh life, and it was a lot different back in the 70s working those kinds of operations. I remember. Uh, so were you ever involved in do you remember the PISA meetings with the Sonora guys?
I remember the meetings that were held, and that was usually the guys from the DEA office. And then there was when I worked with the Narcotics Task Force out of San Diego, they had the meetings. But it seemed like whenever there was a meeting and there was always an accompanying party,
Yeah,
I, I was I was somewhere else.
it's a good idea. Yeah, there were some crazy people involved down there.
There were a lot of crazy people involved. But back then, the relationship that we could develop individually, whether it was with the federal judicial police or the Sonora State Police, on a case by case individual basis. We got some things done. I
Yeah.
wouldn't buy a used car from anybody, but you know, we made things work mutually for both sides.
Yeah, as best you can. I never uh, discounted those guys. I mean, it was a different world across the line. They're doing the same thing we did for $65 a month with a broken six shooter, probably a 22 in their belt, you know, and
It was
it was brutal.
There
Yeah.
were and there were limitations. I mean, and you had to appreciate and respect the limitations on what they had uh, available to them and what they could do for you.
Yeah.
And there were people that I worked with that would pass judgment on them because of that.
Yeah.
But they didn't respect the situation that they were in because, where you and I had protections and to a degree and, resources and and God forbid, somebody came after us, we could rally the troops, which we did more than once.
Mhm.
But they didn't have access to that. And so you had to appreciate and respect the position that they were in and be happy that you could get something from them if you needed it, even if it was nothing more than a warning.
Yeah. So after your time down there, you wound up in Mesa eventually.
They were going to as is often the case, we were highly successful at the state strike force. And then it became a legislative battle between the Department of Public Safety and the strike force and who could garner the most support. The strike force it was decided would be merged with the Department of Public Safety, and we had no idea what was going to happen. We didn't know if our retirement would transfer. There were all kinds of political issues, and I didn't want to run the risk of being a highway patrolman up on Interstate 40 on the New Mexico border.
Yeah.
So there were few opportunities for laterals at the time. Chandler and Mesa were the only two departments of significance, so to say, that would accept my training and certification at CAC. And they both offered me jobs. Mesa paid the most.
Yeah. And so we crossed paths in Mesa and night shift and
Yeah, I
the
think I
patrol
think you and I
division.
were both. I think we were both FTOs at the time,
Yeah, training
training
guys.
training new babies. And
Yeah.
I think that the night that we were out, you and I don't remember who was with you. Um, I don't know who I was with, but we caught a burglar.
Always happy memories.
I told him not to run. I told that boy, don't run.
Don't run. Bad things happen. And it was true. Bad things did happen to him. But yeah, and then you went on become uh, involved in persons crimes, master police officer.
I was promoted and went to sex crimes and worked. It seemed maybe because of the target on my back and my rank, I was assigned some of the more difficult, complex cases, high profile cases, and politically sensitive cases. And from there, I went to homicide, and then I was caught up in what would probably best be called special projects. And then they wanted to resurrect the intelligence unit because it had gone by the wayside since you left. So I was involved in rebuilding the intelligence unit and getting our membership into LEIU and establishing the department as a trustworthy and reputable organization when it came to criminal intelligence. And that's where I retired from.
And since retirement, you've been a writer.
I wrote. I worked as a private investigator for a large firm in Phoenix that did primarily insurance defense work. I did cases representing the state, the Department of Corrections, learned about forest fires and truck accidents and all kinds of things. Um, I did that kind of work for about 6 years. Then I spent 10 years as a drug agent with the National Football League. And then I retired.
Yeah. Uh, Now, did you load from loops at one time in your career?
When I started shooting as a kid, and I started hunting as a kid. I went in the Marine Corps when I was 17, and in the Marine Corps, for those viewers that are Marines, we're all riflemen. The foundation of the Marine Corps is we're all riflemen. So 2 weeks at Edson Range at Camp Pendleton really drilled home the fundamentals in shooting. Then when I went to the police academy, um, we were issued a 4-inch Smith & Wesson Model 15 Combat Masterpiece 38 Special. We shot bullseye from the 50-yard line to hone our skills as shooters. And we loaded from the loops.
There you go.
Because the philosophy for some back then was that speed loaders were not reliable. They hadn't been proven. And so I shot a revolver last week at the range for fun. I still load 2 at a time and rotate the cylinder with my thumb counterclockwise, just like the guy taught me.
Respect for tradition. There you go.
50 years later, I still do it the same way.
Good.
You know, funny story is my first sergeant's test I took. One of the guys on the panel was an old-time shooter he'd been at Phoenix PD, ran state narcotics, was a captain at the Department of Public Safety. And he asked me, he says, you walk out of here today and somebody opens fires on you and you fire back 6 shots, which direction does your cylinder turn? Colt turns clockwise, Smith & Wesson turns counterclockwise. I said, sir, my cylinder doesn't turn. I carry a 1911 45 automatic and I have 2 rounds left. I didn't get promoted.
Yeah, well, back World War champ. You can't go wrong with 1911, right? So, all right, Bill. Well, thanks for kind of bringing us up to date and sharing us some things with us. Do you have any closing thoughts about the evolution of police work as we wrap up our visit?
I think, when you and I started, Dan, there were sound fundamentals. There were basics. It was, sort of like in the Marine Corps, keep it simple, stupid. And I think that allowed us to grow. I think it allowed us to make decisions. I think it gave us an opportunity to learn because it gave us that flexibility. I think there was also a greater trust in what we could and couldn't do by the people that we work for. And when we made mistakes, unless they were just, criminal,
Yeah.
They were learning experiences. And I think, looking at your career and looking at my career, and especially looking at your supervision and leadership experience, that's really paid off. And, and my success. And I think that, one of the things that's, become apparent now in law enforcement is there's a rule for everything. And there's not always an answer in a book. And when you look at the adversaries and that face law enforcement, and whether they be organized criminals or casual criminals or opportunities, who commit violent crime or property crime, they're operating without the rules. And I know when I retired and I was cleaning out my locker, this young officer came up to me because he noticed that I had a stack of papers in the bottom of my locker that was probably about 4 foot high. And he walked up to me and he said, sir, what are those? And I looked at him and I said, that's 10 years of policy and procedure updates. And he said, aren't you supposed to keep those in your book? And I said, you know what, kid? I said, if you know the law, if you obey the law, you'll be just fine.
Yeah.
He either probably did really well or got fired shortly thereafter. But I think that, that it's to the point now that the complexity and the rule for everything and the number of people in leadership that don't have the experience like you have has really made it a great time to be a criminal.
Yeah. Sadly, that's true. My hope is to preserve more of the art of police work that's yielding way to the science only, prescribed only, spelled out only, rules only police work. The discretion is so important.
It really is. And if you think about it, and I know all my time in uniform was spent in poor areas, and the people that live there, like in the Escobedo housing projects where I walked, 99% of those people are just trying to get by, just like us.
Yeah.
And they really need the police.
Yeah.
And they want the police, but it's important that the police understand that they may not see things the way you do, but if they're not out hurting people, and they're not breaking laws that are I don't know how you draw the line, but that's back to your mention of discretion, that most people are just trying to get by. So what can the police do to help ensure that they're safe and that they do get by?
Yeah.
And that goes back to the discretion, because you can't have a rule for everything.
Yeah.
And I think back to some of the times that I used discretion that led to informants that I used, where down the road we made significant cases against class 1 and class 2 violators because I used my discretion and I didn't take somebody to jail, or I didn't hammer as hard as I could have.
Yeah. So many stories like that, and it's very, very true. Well, listen, Bill, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate
Man,
everyone was able to take something away from it and got a little feel for what it was like to be in Arizona, rural Arizona in the 70s and the narcotics wars of the 70s. And appreciate you joining me. Thank you.
right, Dan, call anytime. Take care. Good to see you.
All right. It was good to see you. Thanks, Bill.
Loading from Loops is brought to you by Sabbath Learning. Register now for the Excellence in Law Enforcement courses. Click the link below for more information.